and welcome to this online lecture. My name is Seamus Perry. I'm an English tutor at Balliol, and it's my great pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague, Bysshe Coffey, who is going to talk to us today about the long and tangled life of Shelley's posthumous existence. Bysshe is an early career fellow in English literature at the college. He's the author of a wonderful book called Shelley's Broken World, Fractured Materiality and Intermitted Song, which was published by Liverpool University Press in 2021. And he's, among ongoing work, he's responsible for Shelley's translations from the Greek for the magnificent multi-volume Johns Hopkins University Press edition of the works of Shelley. And also, along with Nora Crook and Anna Mercer, he's preparing an edition of one of the great treasures, which is a Shelley notebook in the Library of Congress. And for any of you who have any familiarity with the utter impenetrability of Shelley's handwriting, you can recognize that these are indeed heroic tasks that he has been commissioned to fulfill. He has a very glittery track record. He's a graduate of Cambridge. He's been a fellow at the Huntington Library in Pasadena. He's been an Armstrong Browning Library visiting scholar, which is an amazing collection in Waco in Texas. And he's also had a Pforzheimer Award from the Keats Shelley Society of America. And not the least of his distinctions is that he won a British Academy postdoctoral fellowship, which is, I'm delighted to say, what brings him to Balliol. So we are delighted to welcome him this evening to the online lecture series. His title is Shelleyolatry and Shelleyphobia, the Reception History of Percy Bysshe Shelley. So Bysshe, over to you.
Thank you very much, Seamus. I'll just share my screen. Okay. Thank you very much. Well, it's a delight and honor to speak to you all today. I hope to tell you a little about the reception history of Percy Bysshe Shelley. I say a little because over the past couple of years, I have come to realize just how extensive and varied that history happens to be, a history that remains untold, even largely unacknowledged. But then we shouldn't be too surprised. Poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world, or so Shelley has it. The pronouncement purposefully, of course, asks for strong reactions. If quoted, it is often to be clung to, perhaps savaged, derided, or cast aside as so much wishful thinking. And we can think of Auden's poetry makes nothing happen. But as a statement, it has become oddly prophetic of Shelley's own case, because legislators did read him. Shelley talked politics with the Greek hero, statesman, and diplomat Alexandros Mavrokordatos. Gladstone read him. Disraeli did too. In America, one of the shortest serving presidents, William Henry Harrison, lamented that all the measures of the government are directed to the purpose of making the rich richer and the poor poorer. Now, Harrison there adapted and popularized a Shelleyanism. The rich get richer and the poor get poorer, to be found in A Defense of Poetry, first published in 1839. It was an essay that quickly set about doing the rounds. Hunting long ago and far away for Shelley material, I happened upon this. It is the edition in which the Defense of Poetry first appears. Essays, letters from abroad, translations and fragments. It was first edited, of course, by the great Mary Shelley. And this copy, my copy, belonged to Francis Lasseter, a Democrat, attorney, and US representative from Virginia. And thoroughly annotated it is too, particularly the Defense of Poetry. I love his benign visage. And here we have the atomic Shelley, you know, that a single word even may be a spark of inextinguishable thought, and thus all the great historians, Herodotus, Plutarch, Livy, were poets. I love the idea of a legislator poring over this. We then have the idea that poetry saves us from convention. It strips the veil of familiarity from the world and lays bare the naked and sleeping beauty, which is the spirit of its forms. And of course, an antidote to the parochial. The poetry defeats the curse which binds us to be subjected to the accident of surrounding impressions. And then that glorious bit over here where he, of course, has got rather excited with his particular marginal strike that poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world. Now, closer to home, the politician, journalist, and founder of the National Secular Society, Charles Bradlaugh, had Shelley as one of his heroes. He had an odd combination of them, actually. He put them with Malthus and Jesus and wrote a very strange lecture on them, but it's an admirable attempt to fashion something new. And Shelley constitutes a looming presence in many a progressive movement. We find him animating the thought of socialists, Marxists, of course, but also suffragettes and different shades of feminist. The secularists and humanists love him, and the English positivists, you know, the ones that particularly come out of Wadham, so Richard Congreve. It's very odd, actually. No work has been done on this, but they draw on their ideas of home rule, etc., from Shelley's work in Ireland. It's a particularly fruitful area I hope to look into this year. Anyway, in each case, he is a name that is summoned as both an influence and an enabling example of free thought. For the great Victorian reformer, Henry Stephen Salt, he is, or who was a writer, a social reformer for prisons, schools, campaigner against cruel sports, an anti-vivisectionist, a vegetarian, friend to Gandhi. Shelley was a true pioneer in morals. To me, he wrote, Shelley has always appeared as one of those great poets who, like great mountains, if rightly viewed and approached, can give strength and comfort to mankind. Prometheus Unbound is not less beautiful to the ear and still more beautiful to the heart. He changed my life. His Shelley Primer in 1887 is a rather unusual book, and it sought to introduce readers to Shelley's moral reach, his ethical imagination, or Shelley the Lost Leader. And I love the idea of this primer because, as you see, you get these lovely headings: politics, ideality, subjectivity, love, democracy. Has various different entries, and you then just read the little gloss on where you'll find Shelley's instructions on these particular topics, or sort of improving example, how it will help you through it. So if it is a primer, then it's for an exam that's practical, and the exam is life and battling against convention. And closer to home, of course, the poet is there in the title of the 2017 Labour Party manifesto. The final line of the Mask of Anarchy, "Ye are many, they are few," becomes "for the many, not the few." Although I do find it charming that I think it was when Corbyn said, "I want to recite my favourite verse from the Mask of Anarchy," he had to have a cue card and read it with particular agony. Now, anyway, beyond the legislators, again and again, Shelley appears in this or that important figure's conversion story. There are many accounts of Baptists reading Shelley only to become Unitarians, or Anglicans turned positively into positivists. The discovery of Shelley and or his life is frequently marked as a transformative experience, a significant moment in an individual's intellectual and moral development. Shelley is said to provide alternatives, new possibilities of life. Eleanor Marx thought him a feminist hero because of his brave experiments in living and the revolutionary women that people his poems. And Shelley offered the same revelations to Vernon Lee and Amy Levy. And Olive Schreiner, of course, the wonderful South African writer, wrote that I took my Shelley to bed and slept with it. I loved so and read a whole year every day. Under the poem of the skylark, I drew little lines with a pencil to show where the accent came. And Gilbert Murray, the Regius Professor of Greek, speaking on the subject of literature and revelation to the Literary and Philosophical Society of Newcastle upon Tyne, itself the place where, in 1887, one of the more energetic branches of the Shelley Society was formed. Indeed, the Shelley Society spread throughout the world. There was one in Melbourne, there was one in Cambridge, Massachusetts. It was a fantastic sort of franchise that just took off, only to die. But he averred that to a man who has once read himself into Shelley, the world never looks the same. And Murray had some things in common with Shelley beyond his facility with classical languages. As an Australian schoolboy, he had been bullied relentlessly, but like Shelley, he fought back. He says in an essay on humanism and stoicism that the cruelty to animals in my school in the bush almost drove me mad, and I had many fights about it. And there were other things I hated almost as much. When first, by mere accident, I came across the writings of Shelley, I was almost dazzled by finding suddenly the expression of my own unspoken dream. This, I felt, was the right thing. This was what I wanted, what I craved for. It was the antidote to all the coarseness and brutality and contempt for weaker creatures which raged about me. I think that's terribly moving, and it's a particular moment that actually speaks to Shelley's own representation of his life. In the dedicatory preface to Mary Shelley in his revolutionary epic of 1817, Leon and Cythna, Shelley writes of his time at Eton, I do remember well the hour which burst my spirit's sleep. A fresh May dawn it was, when I walked forth upon the glittering grass and wept. I knew not why, until there rose from the near schoolroom voices that, alas, were but one echo from a world of woes. It is then that the speaker makes his pledge. I will be wise and just and free and mild, if in me lies such power, for I grow weary to behold the selfish and the strong still tyrannize without reproach or check. So beyond these figures, Shelley also laces, throughout the poet of Tennyson, Browning, Swinburne, Hardy, Leon and Cythna, and Epipsychodion, for instance, particularly pulse beneath the agony of Jude the Obscure. He is there in Kipling also, Yeats, Joyce, and he was a guide to D.H. Lawrence. His poetry, going backwards, even inspired some of the Brontes. So I'm not just talking about illusion here. There's a lot of that, and that's glorious, but that's not what I'm talking about. We're talking about statements, identifications. These are people who are openly Shelleyan. He even haunts the landscape of the First World War. Poets again and again identify with him, and I could go on. In America, for instance, he inspired Herman Melville and Nathaniel Hawthorne, and utterly transformed Edgar Allan Poe, who, when translated by Baudelaire, changed into a very strange phenomenon indeed, French Poe. He was thought by rather bright people, oddly, to be a great aesthetician and a genius, and Shelley was conceived of as his grand precursor. Edmund Wilson, the great literary critic, put it rather well in Axel's Castle. He thought that Poe became one of the portals to symbolism, and then you've got the whole of English modernism. And we all know what happened next. So Shelley was already at work defining and redefining European literature, whether or not critics could agree about his worth. The writers were already deciding. And his work generated a number of very fine reviews and assessments during the second half of the 19th century and early 20th century by, for instance, George Henry Lewes, Robert Browning, Matilda Blind, again, the Balliol man Swinburne, George Bernard Shaw, and A.C. Bradley. Yet we tend to remember only one, and that's Matthew Arnold's essay, of course, in which he refers to Shelley as an ineffectual angel. A more representative anthology of essays by the Victorians on Shelley would, I think, be a useful, if not an urgent corrective. I mean, urgent for me, but perhaps not for everyone. Because, of course, Shelley also influenced the formation of the English curriculum. Another Balliol man, John Churton Collins, Tennyson's louse in the locks of literature, was one of the great advocates for the establishment of English literature, and he was a committed Shelleyan, editing a very interesting edition of his poems. But for all this admiration, amounting at one extreme to Shelleyolatry, there was, sat at the other end of the table, a great dislike, even hatred, as I've hinted at in bringing in Matthew Arnold. Thomas Carlyle enjoyed baiting repeatedly the poet's admirers. True to his vinegary temperament, he described Shelley to Browning as weak in genius, weak in character, for these two always go together, a poor, spasmodic, hectic, shrill, and pallid being. And Carlyle transformed the poet into a spectre also in another description, getting rid of Shelley's body altogether and comparing his works to some demented and unattended seance. He says that the poems are like the writhing of a ghost, uttering infinite wail into the night, unable to help itself or anybody else. Charles Kingsley also got on the hatred bus. He warned against the growing popularity of Shelley's poetry and compared it to an insidious addiction, instilling a lack of manly self-control. He says, the private sipping of eau de cologne, say the London physicians, has increased mightily of late, and so has the reading of Shelley. Walter Bagehot thought the poet's lack of self-control revealed the most remarkable instance of the pure impulsive character. Victorian biographers and memoirists often describe him as an example of physical weakness with his cracked voice, hysterical affections, and hallucinations. G.K. Chesterton, who I've been rather unkind to represent thus with this picture, was responding. He wrote a review of Salt's primer, and Salt was one of his sandal-wearing vegetarian cranks. And he said that Shelley amounted to a great epic about an inspiring example of nothing in particular at no particular time. So Shelley was thought with and fought over. Now I speak to you today in the final month of Shelley's bicentennial year. 200 years ago this July, our poet died by water. For the past 2 years, my research has covered the important period in Shelley reception, editing and diffusion, which begins with the death of Mary Shelley in 1851 and ends with the centenary of Shelley's death in 1922, a time of astonishing energy, criticism, textual scholarship, distinct editorial principles. I mean, this is my sort of totem pole really to Shelley editors, but also complex genera of Shelleyolatry and Shelleyphobia. I spend my time away from Balliol in Bodley and other archives reconstructing this period. Now, Edward Augustus Freeman, the Regius Professor of History here at Oxford between 1884 to 1892, might have claimed that the new discipline of English literature, for all its undiscipline, risked slipping into mere chatter about Shelley, but it has been my pleasure to discover how brilliant and varied the stuff of that chatter can and has been. There were so many Shelleys on offer. There were a multitude of Shelleys to choose from. But we Shelley scholars and critics have tended to tell a strangely simple story about this period. It goes kind of something like this. There were the haters. Alongside these Shelley haters, there were the worshippers and adulators who idealized Shelley, obstructed his editors, and frustrated genuine Shelleyans, the Chartists, Marxists, Socialists. Well, that is the story that's still being told. It holds fast and remains quite popular. This story persists, I believe, in part because narratives of hostility are appealing to nervous critics in search of justification for what they do. Indeed, in this roundup of the enormous effect of Shelley that Shelley had on the 19th century and its cultural life, I seem to have fallen into doing the same thing. But despite this polarity which exists, there is a subtler reception of Shelley that we need to consider. because we tend to ignore the contributions of those who have been bluntly cast as impediments, and to pump up only to moan and brood over comments with which we might have engaged differently. And I hope to do something about that more generally, and to give you an example of that today. So I want to turn now to two figures who are among the lodestones of this simple story. I want to shake them loose and let some of the edifice fall, so that maybe we're left with just two trunkless legs of stone in the desert. I have chosen them because they seem at first sight the ideal representatives of the two extremes in the reception history of Shelley. The first is Shelley's daughter-in-law, Jane Lady Shelley, and the other is one of the greatest literary critics of the 20th century, F.R. Leavis. I know that's a controversial statement for some people, but together they should afford us a glimpse of the Shelley worshipper and adulator par excellence on that side, and the perfect Shelleyphobe on the other. But in truth, they refuse to fit into either. Now, Jane Lady Shelley, the wife of the Shelleys' only surviving son, Sir Percy Florence, arrives in the mind with unhappy baggage. She is so easily mocked. I mean, I'll give you a quick example. Thank you very much to Stephen Hebron of the Bodleian for allowing me to share these two examples from the Abinger papers. First, this is a visionary portrait that Lady Jane Shelley penned of Mary. So this is her sort of visionary figure, because she spoke to Mary in automatic writing sessions. So when she was a little bit stressed or aggrieved, as you can see here, don't mind Mr. Peacock, you know, he won't live another year now, you will get more papers. She's talking about Thomas Love Peacock and the whole dispute that's going over about Harriet and you know, Shelley's first wife. And so she has these gloriously charming, I think, spiritualist elements. But of course, yes, that is the easily risible Jane. Now, that figure has been consolidated and is pretty much what we have in mind. Here again, I mean, this is a kind of, I think this is quite charming actually, because she had a great sense of humor. This is her in her conservatory in Boscombe, and she had two, well, she adored canaries, and she had one room where all the male canaries lived, which was the monastery, and then she had another room which she called the nunnery, which was where the female canaries live. And then she would have these little parties where she would open the doors, and they would obviously have their abelard, etc. fun, and then she'd close them again. So I think she's quite fun, but the most important thing is she is not what she is often being painted as. So yes, eccentric, slightly quirky, all that stuff, yes, but more than that. Now, she's often characterized as the worshipper, as I say, a fool, a crank, a martinet, a gatekeeper, whatever. The list goes on. And some of you will be familiar with the story of a bric-a-brac reliquary housed in a recess of her boudoir at Boscombe, the sanctum, the Shelley sanctum, whereof the ceiling was painted with stars, to which only the family and those she deemed worthy were permitted entry to spend precious time with precious things, locks of hair, jewelry, manuscripts, portraits, more hair, a lot of hair. There's the ghoulish tale of how she organized the exhumation of the bodies of Wollstonecraft and Godwin, which traveled by night to Bournemouth, where they now rest. And she's the commissioner of the so-called effete statues with her husband. She had hoped also to install a bust of the poet at Eton College, but her efforts didn't come off. Now, as with Lady Shelley, it has become fashionable to despise the two monuments we do have, which she commissioned. The responses they inspire are extreme. I found this very surprising. There's one by Henry Weekes, this is it, a Pieta at Christchurch Priory in Dorset, and of course, Edward Onslow Ford's impressive memorial at Shelley's alma mater, University College, Oxford, a work of which the sculptor was justly proud. It features in the background of his self-portrait, but it had an uncertain start. Guido Biaggi writer, librarian, and Shelleyan, heard of Lady Shelley's difficulties finding a home for Ford's work in Oxford and thought that Via Reggio would be a fitting substitute. Failing that, he asked might she consider sponsoring a bronze cast of it, but it wasn't to be. The memorial found its current location with the help of Lady Shelley's friend, Balliol's former master, Benjamin Jurt, who knew that under the mastership of James Frank Bright, the college was growing slowly fonder of, or to put it another way, its antipathy was lessening towards its troublesome alumnus, and that it might be inclined to make room. At the college unveiling in 1893, the master said to those present that the memorial was a thing which any giver might be proud to give and any receiver might be proud to receive. Now, I talk about these two things for the simple reason that Paul Foot's Read Shelley is the book that most students who first come to Shelley will quote. Very popular. It's in many respects is a very admirable book. Published in 1980, it, however, encouraged Shelleyans to hate this memorial before they'd even seen it. He relates a story of Univ's sportsman right at the beginning in the introduction. He says that the, quote, the nation's future leaders squeezing between the bars of Shelley's cage and wreaking havoc on the statue would shout, "We've got Shelley's balls." That was the plummy cry of triumph, which would echo through the quadrangles at 3 or 4 in the morning. The authorities shrugged their shoulders and sought out a mason and replaced the missing parts. Now that's how the book begins. And I remember as a youngster first reading it thinking, oh golly, well, this must be what is this hideous statue? The problem is, of course, the story isn't actually true. One of the great truth tellers, Paul Foot, can't help but tell a fib here for rhetorical purposes. Yes, the memorial has been subject to many a creative jape. I believe we have Univ's archivist, the great Dr. Robin Darwell-Smith, in the audience, who has told me a great deal about them, as he is a former member of the college. And my favorite is the one where you have the muse here, as you can see, and on her lap, some very smart undergraduate would put a copy of the Times crossword, which I think is I think it's quite improving. I like that. But the key thing is his member was never severed. It was never removed. And so why does Paul Foot set this up? He sets it up because he can then say the following: the castration of Shelley at British places of learning has not been confined to rowing oaths. It seems rather charming as a, okay, fine, rhetorical flourish, but of course it's not true. Also at the places of learning, you have Goldsworthy, Lowes, Dickinson, you had Nathaniel Webb, these absolute remarkable radicals who were telling all of their students to read Shelley. If you want to go into proper academic, classical studies, look at somebody like George Thompson, who in his books on Aeschylus or on the evolution of Greek philosophy is telling people to read Shelley. Shelley's Prometheus Unbound is a great way into Aeschylus. And so it's not true, it's cheap. And the problem is this sort of tawdry cheapness has outlasted our days, and we need to do something about it. So I begin with these statues because they are often the first to come to mind when it comes to Lady Shelley. And like most things in which she played a part, they are subject to profound misunderstanding. When I showed some of the pictures of the memorials in Italy, for instance, the audience were profoundly moved by them, affected by them. They wanted to see them. They thought they were beautiful. And I do think that sometimes there's the difference in terms of visual cultural education can come into this. I don't know why Shelleyans in particular are averse to wanting to see them. I do wonder how many people who judge them so harshly on that lavatory wall called Twitter, which I've experienced, have actually seen them in the flesh. Now, the prejudice against Lady Shelley and her works is one of the lasting results of the simplification that I've been talking about. Thanks to Paul Foot's amusing story, and it is amusing, she is often taken to be one of the arch emasculators and airbrushers of Shelley. And I think we are in danger of forgetting what a startlingly daring statue it must have been in 1893. It is, in fact, hard to think of a comparable statue of any literary figure represented naked. The nearest parallel is perhaps Rodin's depiction of the nude Victor Hugo, but I'm sure the audience will maybe they'll have something else in mind. Whatever Lady Shelley was, she did not conform to the popular idea of the Victorian prude. Recent essays by one of the greatest Shelley experts, Dr. Bruce Barker Benfield, and Michael Rossington, another a remarkable Shelleyan and a Balliol man, have sort of asked us to look again at Lady Shelley, to begin a reassessment of her and Sir Percy Florence's activities. Michael Rossington has written powerfully in an essay titled Commemorating the Relic, the Beginnings of the Bodleian Shelley Collection for the Bodleian Library Record, about the couple's wish to preserve Shelley's poetry and reputation, arguing that Lady Shelley followed Mary's own commitment to posterity. That is to say, the whole story of the Shelleys could not be told right away, but it would be preserved and gradually revealed to the public. This shared strategy actually comes into the case of even William Michael Rossetti. He kind of recognizes this and agonizes over how much you tell if you want to guarantee a readership straight away. How comfortable and established are the facts that we can play with? Indeed, Lady Shelley shared this strategy with Jowett, who put it in his little notebook. He talks about it. It's a rather interesting entry. Now, with her husband, Lady Shelley was committed to ensuring an audience for Shelley. That was the key thing. And it was a partnership. They divided their labours. We are often told that they were conservative and promoted a safely depoliticized Shelley and so on. Yet it was Sir Percy who chose to publish Shelley's unorthodox essay on Christianity as an appendix to Lady Shelley's Shelley Memorials, and who later gave permission for the publication of one of Shelley's most irreverent texts, On the Devil and Devils, which appeared for the first time in the second volume of Harry Buxton Forman's The Prose Works of Percy Bysshe Shelley, published in 1880. Now, as an example of where open-mindedness to what Lady Shelley has to offer. Oh, sorry, I forgot to share this. These were the original plans for the Shelley Memorial. There were supposed to be two viewing positions, the lower seat down here and then the higher bay window, so that you're going to see them from two platforms. But going back to that open-mindedness, I want to take on the case of her copy of Thomas Jefferson Hoggs' controversial Life of Shelley, published in 1858. I want to thank now the Pforzheimer for letting me share this image with you. She had commissioned Hogg to write this biography, and it went rather badly. Hogg took liberties, adapted documents, edited things in a way that made Shelley look absolutely ludicrous. And he only 2 of a proposed 4 were published, although apparently, and on good authority, it seems that he had written all 4, and those last 2 volumes have been lost and possibly destroyed. But what does Jane Lady Shelley do? Well, she agrees with all of the radicals on Hoggs' portrayal. She does not like the fact that he says constantly that Shelley had a shrill, cracking voice, and she comes up with a touching justification and says, well, maybe his voice was breaking, even though the comment that she's addressing would have had Shelley at 18 and having his voice breaking, which is perhaps not so believable. But there are other bits where Hogg says that Shelley could not have understood Linnaeus or botany. And for anyone who knows of, Shelley's polymathic reading, that's obviously ludicrous. And she in her marginal notes makes this very, very clear. She's like, this is obviously a man who has an agenda. Now, to round up, I want to now turn to Lewis, because the period of my research ends in 1922, the year of Shelley's bicentenary, the year of Shelley's centenary, which coincides with the reaction against Romanticism that particularly impacted on Shelley's reputation. Now, T.S. Eliot and F.R. Lewis are the 2 who are usually associated with the negative assessments of Shelley, Lewis in particular, with the judgment that Shelley had a weak grasp upon the actual. Yet, if we start looking at these figures in more detail, we realize that, again, the characterization is not quite clear. Eliot later in life also wrote, for instance, one of the most admiring statements. Shelley was, quote, the only English poet of the 19th century who could even have begun to follow in those footsteps. Now, to whom did those footsteps belong? Dante. While Leavis, so far from telling students that Shelley was not worth reading, and I've had the privilege of talking to some of his former students, he actually directed students away from the canon set up by Palgrave's Golden Treasury, the short lyrics, and pointed them towards reading a hard-edged Shelley, the Shelley who wrote The Mask of Anarchy and Peter Bell III. Yes, he dismissed much of Shelley's work as emotionally self-indulgent, but of Mask of Anarchy, he wrote these memorable words, quote, that Shelley sees what is in front of him too clearly and with too pure a pity and indignation to have any regard for his emotions as such. Late in life, in a little-known conversation, he admitted, "My Shelley essay may have been too extreme. It was written in reaction against Victorian adulation. Shelley was a genius. I may read him again. I insist on the right to contradict myself and so modify." Now, Leavis showed his preparedness to subject himself to self-revaluation. We, in turn, now tend to sneer at Leavis where he is remembered at all. A reception history is about the endless work of recreation and revaluation. We inherit our prejudices. That is part of the process, but we must recognize them as such and so modify too. Mere chatter about Shelley? Not really, because to talk about Shelley is to talk about a lot else besides. Thank you very much. I'll hand back to Seamus.
Lovely. Thank you, Bysshe, very much for a terrific talk. What I should have said in my opening remarks is that there's a question and answer button on your Zoom screen, and anyone who wishes to raise a question for me to put to Bysshe, if you could please type your question into that, then I will pass it on to him. But before I do that, let me ask, I thought that was absolutely fascinating, Bysshe. I really did. Do you think there is something about this oddly sort of divided posthumous reputation that Shelley has, particularly within his politics, that speaks to something that is actually true about Shelley in his own right? I'm struck, for example, by the fact that Paul Foot wants him to be a kind of rather rampant militant kind of proto-socialist or perhaps just socialist. But on the other hand, as you were quoting, I thought very much to the point, Shelley's own self-characterization, at least at some points, is much more kind of pacifist and talking about the virtues of mildness, as you pointed out, which doesn't really kind of quite fit into the Socialist Workers' Party kind of interpretation of Shelley. So I suppose what I'm asking is there some way, do you think, in which the diversity of the posthumous reputation actually unlocks something about the heterogeneity of Shelley, in his own right?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things I was always interested in when I first started reading Shelley, was the way in which he inspires these adepts who tend to blunt certain aspects which contradict their story. And I think it's because actually he was remarkable when it came to thinking to the end of philosophical positions. So he would find the aporia or the point of puzzlement that irritates an empiricist or frustrates a proto-socialist. So for instance, when you'll find often a Marxist will say, a Marxist reading of Shelley will say something like, and of course he hated Malthus, and we'll forget that in one letter Shelley says that he's a very clever chap. Well, he doesn't say chap, but he says he's very clever. And the thing with Shelley is that I think Bloom actually said it best. However radical you think you are, he's more radical than you. And that's because he never arrives. He's always on to the next point of thought and the next struggle. So yeah, I think that what we tend to do is forget the very contours of his intellect when we try to put some, I don't know, political or philosophical theory that comes after his death and then sort of say, well, look, it conforms perfectly to it. So yeah, I think it's a deliberate way of evading the puzzle that he is.
And just before we start taking questions from the floor, as it were, does Lady Jane ever offer a view about his political views? I mean, does she express herself anywhere about what she thinks he stands for?
She has a remarkable correspondence with a number of Shelleyians and Garnet and Rossetti. Rossetti she's quite wary about. Garnet's the one who sort of really attracts her attention, and you get a sort of feel that this is why she would wind up the more politically animated readers of Shelley, because yes, she's not so interested in it. She doesn't want to really talk about it, and it's actually part of her strategy. Her when she tries to get that bust in Eton, and when she's trying to establish a readership for him, and we often forget about Lady Shelley, that she was taking on a very male-dominated literary establishment and trying to push a figure who was absolutely Marmite to many people, deliberately divisive. And so she did try to push it away and not talk about the politics so much. But as I gave the example with, the essay on Christianity and Devil and Devils, she's not totally averse to giving some of the more complicated stuff. I mean, the essay on Christianity appeals to Unitarians for so much, because Shelley is he says that Jesus is a great ethical figure, but questions his divinity. So she, I think that it's some and some with her. She doesn't want to take on the stuff that she knows will inevitably be incendiary, and she doesn't have to, because people like Salt, etc., are doing it anyway, so she can just put the story that way.
Okay, so we have a few questions here in the queue. Robert Crawford's interested very much in Boscombe. Do we have any visual evidence of this rather strange sounding sanctum, or is it purely just through documentary records of it? Do any photographs survive of any kind? How do we know about it?
We know mostly about it through people who visited it. So there's a great the best information you'll find is in I think again it's two people I mentioned, Elizabeth Pleniger and Stephen Hebron edited, I think it's Shelley's Ghost, this wonderful catalogue of an exhibition, but it also has great deal of information about the sanctum and the descriptions from people who went there and described what it was like and the strangeness of it, because of course it was only the elite were allowed into it, but yeah, it was a very dimly lit room. We know that it had a peach ceiling, and it was very good for the eyes. But Shelley's Ghost has the most information on it.
Right, and all those relics and other bits and pieces, they're part of the Bodleian collection now.
Yeah, so most of them have now been given to the Bodleian and in various installments.
Okay, so you can see the bits and pieces, even though you can't reconstruct the
you can see bits and pieces. I was hoping one time to maybe sequence Shelley's DNA with one of those locks of hair, but I thought it would be terribly, it could be the first close reading of the genome or whatever.
I think you've crossed the line there, actually.
Yeah.
All right, okay. Well, so we have Drummond here. This is a momentous occasion, because Drummond is prepared to recant his prejudice against Levis on the grounds of that late quote. But he's interested in that link between Shelley and Melville that you drew up. Could you say a little bit more about that that connection, because that's quite an interesting one, isn't it?
Yeah, Melville's he writes a poem on the tomb of Shelley, which is very very moving, and the tomb being the sea, the seabed, etc. But he was one of those examples for, I think Melville draws particularly on his writing of the ocean. So when you sort of look at the letters and you start looking at what the bits that Melville is attracted to, it's a vision of the sea.
Right.
It's actually the stuff that then feeds into obviously his great work, which is funny because of course his friend Emerson is one of the big Shelley haters. Says that Shelley is the worst, but yeah, Melville's drawn to that element, and I think it's the same.
What's the reason for Emerson's antipathy, do you think? Because you'd have thought that kind of quasi-Unitarian kind of aspect of Shelley would positively appeal to Emerson.
Yeah, it's bizarre. I mean, he says, I keep trying, I keep going back, and he just doesn't see anything in it. For him, right. Shelley is, I think it's the stuff that you either see Shelley as this kind of portal into new morality, a new kind of masculinity, etc. But I think it was, I can't remember, it was Hawthorne who said that I would sooner think of clutching Emerson's arm as I would clutching a piece of barbed wire. And so I think that we forget that that we think that Emerson is actually sort of, I think there's probably a bit of the masculinity which troubled him about Shelley. And then when you look at Emerson, of course, Emerson says the same about, he feels the same about Whitman in the end. He likes the sort of the prophet, but then towards the end he's like, hang on, so some questionable parts of masculinity here. So I think it's probably on his vision of what a man should be.
Just like Tennyson saying about Hallam, if you think I called him dear while he was alive, you're very much mistaken. Okay, we've got a very nice question here about which biography would you recommend to someone who is pretty new to Shelley?
So for me, it's got to be Richard Holmes's The Pursuit, because it's just beautiful. And whilst one might disagree with certain aspects of it, it is the one that I will always go back to. It's the most enjoyable to read.
It's a brilliant book, isn't it? I mean,
incredible.
Yes, I mean his Coleridge biography is amazing, but I think the Shelley biography is maybe his masterpiece. But
he's got that romantic sort of as he says, I packed into my backpack the two volumes of Jones's Letters of Shelley and set off in his footsteps, and then drank red wine with the and then stuff. And it's got that flavor to it, but without all the negatives that would suggest. It's actually just pure immersion.
Okay, so we have a nice question here from the master, who asks how Shelley is viewed by current students, what your students think about him, and especially bearing in mind current student political interest in questions of identity. Does that feature in their response to Shelley?
Yeah, I think that there are certain aspects that I hadn't anticipated before, which is that certain aspects of the androgyny of certain characters in The Witch of Atlas, we talk about the witch herself. She is particularly attractive to certain students and particular developments in queer theory. But I think that one of the interesting things is that Shelley still proves for students one of those things you either instantly get and want to know more about, or you're sort of completely agnostic about, and it's because he's so hard to teach in a very brief amount of time, because the amount of learning that goes into Prometheus Unbound, for instance, or Epipsychodion, these beguiling poems, and you don't want to just restrict them to the lyrics. So the best way is to go through the relevance of androgyny in contemporary debates, but the other is the hard-nosed politics that appealed to Leavis.
Mm-hmm. Yes, okay. Next one. Sorry, I'm just keeping an eye on these questions coming in. So a very good question from Catherine Turner, who wants to know how intertwined were the posthumous critical reputations of Percy and Mary Shelley? Were they often, paired, or did they have separate sort of posthumous trajectories, or how did that work?
Yeah, so I mean, there was if you sort of go out into the street now and you ask somebody about Shelley, the first person they'll think about is Mary Shelley, and it never used to be that way. So most people, students come to me ready with Frankenstein straight away. And that's because that posthumous reputation was all about securing a readership for Shelley at first, and that's what Mary Shelley's efforts were about. Jane Lady Shelley and Percy Florence were like, that was their mission. Mary wasn't the genius. You didn't have to worry about Mary. She was great, but she wasn't the genius. And of course, after the Victorian period, there becomes this great reassessment of her profound talents, her brilliance. And so it takes a while. It's, people like, I think somebody's in the audience here, like Nora Crook and Betty Bennett and the great scholars who started securing her reputation. She was always read by serious people, but she didn't have the promotion behind her as Shelley. But all of that effort that went into, Percy ended up kind of naturally launching her anyway. So it's now, as we say, the woman is definitely on top.
So we have a very nice contribution from Robin Darwell-Smith, who you mentioned in your talk, and it's less a question and more of a report back from slightly sad experience by the sound of it. The Shelley Memorial has had its moments, he says, at the hands of UNIV students, but it's been nothing worse than paint. And I certainly remember as an undergraduate being told that the rugby club used to break into the room with a bottle of Tipp-Ex. But maybe that's what he's referring to. Maybe living with the memorial for 3 years was too much for Paul Foote. Oh, I didn't realize that Foote was actually a UNIV student. Well, that might explain it, mightn't it? And he also comments that there are bits of Hoggs' account of Shelley at UNIV that just don't stack up. So there is something quite interesting going on there.
And actually, if anybody wants to listen to Robin's comments, he makes some brilliant contributions to the recent documentary on Shelley for BBC Radio 4. I think it's ironically called Red Shelley, and then Shelley, the original dub poet, and Robin features in that, and he's absolutely brilliant.
Sounds good. Okay, Ben Cousin has a question very close to my heart, because he wants to ask you something about William Empson's response to Shelley, which is interesting, isn't it? I mean, so Empson is sitting for most of the 1930s in the Far East and looks on this whole kind of Eliot-Leavis sort of nexus that you were talking about, the modernists, that also have a kind of connection with a very reactionary kind of politics, and dislike Shelley within that kind of mindset. Meanwhile, Empson, all those miles away, thinks that Shelley is one of the greatest analysts of the the corruptions and the problematic nature of Christian doctrine, and it's all part of that growing kind of element within William Empson's mind, which will finally bear fruit in his extraordinary kind of controversial book about Milton, which says that the reason why Milton is so good is because he makes God so bad. That's why Paradise Lost is a masterpiece. And Shelley, of course, is one of the people alongside Blake that he adduces as one of the precursors of his argument. How does Shelley fit into that sort of atheistical tradition?
Well, I think it's wonderful as well, because that then takes us perfectly back to Lady Shelley, because it's Lady Shelley and Sir Percy Florence who release on the Devil and Devils to Buxton Forman, which is one of the texts from which he cites, as well as the preface to Prometheus Unbound. But yes, Shelley is right at the heart of that, when Charles Bradlaugh, as I said earlier, and the positivists, even Comte. There was a conversation between a young Comtean who writes to Auguste and says, I think we should put Shelley in the calendar because he's a great ethical leader who doesn't believe in God, and etc. And Comte sort of says, oh yes, I didn't realize, I didn't know of him, but I've read him, and absolutely he's great. Mm-hmm. And so yeah, the necessity of atheism and these particular arguments remain at the center of the humanist tradition. I was talking to Andrew Copson, who's the executive director of the Humanists, and I'm hoping to get him to Balliol to have a talk about actually Shelley's legacy in humanist and secular circles. But the corollary of that is, as well, is that Shelley also was interested in odd theological formulations, such as materia satilis and sensoria. So you can kind of fix him as an atheist, but in other respects, he is as intellectually adventurous with the non-manifest as he is with things seen. So he bamboozles one on that too, I think.
Okay, thank you. So I have a question here from my old friend Liam Whitton, who asks what exactly the Shelley Societies did. Did they have a particular agenda? Was there a particular emphasis within Shelley that they put forward in their discussions or their publications, or did it vary from society to society?
Yeah, I mean, it varied from society to society. So the main one that was founded in London would have conversations and contributions from people like William Margaretti. He would turn up and he would give a lecture on the personages of Prometheus Unbound. So he would give an analysis. It'll be the first time you can suddenly say, okay, who is Demogorgon to Shelley, etc. They would then print these pamphlets. I mean, one of the ones I was citing earlier, they would have these lovely publications that would come out. They were originally slightly bright blue, and they would a series of lectures, poems, facsimiles. So it was actually a kind of very important in the if you think since the Globe Shakespeare and lineation and that whole world of professionalizing the reading of English literature, the Shelley Society, founded by Furnivall, who had done one for the Shakespeare Society 2 and the Browning Society 2, it was a way of professionalizing it, starting to talk about it, a kind of serious reading club. And so that was the London one. It was mainly lectures. Eleanor Marx would come and say, oh, Shelley was a Marxist, and everybody else would go, oh, no, he's actually a Christian in waiting. And then in Melbourne, they'd be saying, no, he's a Unitarian. And in Cambridge, Massachusetts, to say, well, he was actually a mathematician. He would have been a really good mathematician. So there were these, and Newcastle was incredibly vibrant too. So it's quite interesting to look through these branches. But unfortunately, it was eventually bankrupted because of the publication of these things. Because of Wise, but yeah, it was a really cool reading club where you also got some good facsimiles too.
Okay, I've got a couple more questions. If anyone else wants to ask a question, we've got about another 5 minutes or so. I was going to ask you something quite general about something that emerges from your talk, which is the whole fascination with Shelley's sort of remains. And the reason that's in my mind at the moment is that I'd been reading and thinking about James's wonderful short story, The Aspen Papers, which of course is all about someone like you who really wants to get his hands on some material. James translates Shelley into an American poet called James Aspen, but the whole, as you know perfectly well, the whole donné that gives James the idea for the story is learning that Claire Clairmont is still alive as an old lady in Florence, and that there's a kind of an American who's sniffing around who really wants to get hold of the Shelley material that she still has. And there is something very, very charismatic, isn't there, about the Shelley collection of works. And I wondered, I mean, it's a rather vague question, but I wondered if you'd like to sort of speculate about why of all the kind of the relic manuscripts and other bits and pieces remains, this one seems so particularly sort of charismatic. I mean, there's a vast collection of manuscripts in Dove Cottage, but we know why they're there, because they were curated by the family and and so on, and Keats's manuscripts because they were looked after by his friends and so on. But there's something particularly sort of potent somehow about the odd remains that Shelley left behind, don't you think?
Yeah, I think it's because, I mean, when I have honest conversations with other Shelleyans about this, I struggle, no matter how much work I do, to have a clear sense of who he was and what it would have been like to know him. You get a kind of sense from other literary figures that I like. You know, I love Lawrence. You get a sort of, he's similarly flickering, but there is more stability there. But with Shelley, it's very, very difficult. And so you cling, and I don't know why. I think it's because there are competing descriptions of him, but also the kind of personality he is. You know, for many years I wanted to call my kid Mercutio in the hope that they might be a bit like Shelley, until my partner sort of said, no, that's a terrible idea, you know. But it's because I think that mercurial factor of Shelley that really appeals, and that's why I don't think I've ever been happier than when I was first come to Balliol, and I was going through the Avenger papers, and I was committed to reading everything, even you know, the bits of sort of domestic accounting from Lady Shelley of cabbages and lingerie and things of this kind. And then I turned over in this group of papers that she had tried collecting of people who had seen Shelley, probably one of the memoirs that got me closest to understanding what Shelley was like. And it was written by a man called William Tyler. And it's been published in part by Dowden, but it's been mangled and you haven't got all of it. And you do get a sense, I think it's the closest I got to seeing what Shelley would be like. He loved, when he was in Marlow, to go across the river and write on an island away from people. He'd come back wreathed in flowers, you know, and you get this idea of I see this intellectual energy. And so for whatever we try to do when it comes to the solid, there's something that really appeals to Shelleyans, I think, about Shelley's abstract power. He was just this incredible intellect, the acuity, acquisitiveness. So I think why we're obsessed with the relics is because anybody who deals with Shelley is dealing with an absolute cosmos of a brain that's really hard to bring down. And I think it brings us back to Emerson. You know, that's what people like Emerson loathed, whereas people like Melville, of course, anybody who can contemplate the metaphysics of white is going to be up for the abstraction that Shelley poses. You know, that would be my answer.
And can you give us perhaps just to close, can you give us an example of a particular encounter with one of these manuscripts that you know meant a huge amount to you? It's just to convey to people who aren't, you know, living in the rather kind of rarefied profession that you and I occupy, what the work of doing this kind of scholarship is like. To give you time to think. I remember when I was editing a selection of Coleridge's notebooks, and I edited them from the originals, which are mostly in the British Library. And there's an amazing entry where Coleridge is responding to news of the death of Wordsworth's brother, whom he admired greatly, who's drowned in a maritime disaster off the south coast of England in 1804. And I'd read this entry many times. It's a heartfelt expression of grief at the passing of John Wordsworth, which is tied up in all sorts of ways with Coleridge's feelings about Wordsworth and the Wordsworth family. It's very emotionally complicated. And it's a very moving piece of prose as you see it written in, you know, in Times New Roman in the Princeton University Press edition of the notebooks. But when you see the real thing, you read Coleridge's handwriting, which is quite large. And whenever Coleridge is emotionally excited, his handwriting gets larger. So that's one thing that's quite touching about it. But the other thing is that you can see that the teardrops have fallen on the page and the ink has smudged as he's writing, and it's the most extraordinary encounter with a text, and like a living hand has moved across this paper. And I wonder, is there something a bit like that you've encountered in your wanderings in the world of Shelley's manuscripts?
I think my moment is a sort of more of a satirical moment, really. It was when I was looking at one of the notebooks in the Huntington, and sort of got, you know, opening up, and you're seeing some of the cast off verses. It's a sort of nice link to Wordsworth, actually, but it's one of the cast off verses of Peter Bell III, and he's talking about, you know, the Proteus Peter. You know, this is the sort of Wordsworth Coleridge composite. This Proteus Peter, this polyhydric Peter, and it's written in very, very faint pencil, and then there's this sort of polyhydric shape that he's just drawn and it's absolutely bizarre, and you sort of, and I laughed out loud. It was this moment where you sort of saw the wit, but it was an immediate connection, and it was I loathe the tendency to sort of talk about the haptics of the event or the environment of the page, but there is an emotional pull, the just seeing that, and pencil in particular, because it fades and it's so light, and the effort to discern it. So yeah, that was one for me that was, I still think about that, because it just, we often forget about Shelley's humor as well, and it was just made me get.
Yeah. Lovely. Well, I think that's our time. So Bysshe, it's my pleasure to thank you very much on behalf of all of us for a wonderful, stimulating, diverse, fascinating talk, full of great learning, but also presented with great charm and wit, and a delight to listen to. So thank you very, very much. And thank you all for coming. And this, don't forget, is just the latest in an ongoing series of these online lectures. So keep your eyes peeled for the next one, which I guess will be coming up in the next term or so. So good night, everyone, and I hope you all have a very pleasant evening.